Some of the wildest rock and roll moments didn't happen on stage. They happened in the interview chair. From chaotic talk show appearances to brutally honest magazine tell-alls, the biggest names in music sometimes left hosts squirming and fans stunned.
In fact, I might just leave.
Yeah. Oh, I've never had anyone walk out before, but...
And just when you think you've heard it all, you've heard the worst of it. Just wait until you see who completely blew up on live TV. Alice Cooper, mid-70s TV specials and interviews, around 1977. Alice Cooper, boy he was a trip. Back in the early 70s, we all knew him as the guy who brought snakes, guillotines, and gallons of fake blood onto the stage. You just couldn't ignore Alice. Even my mom, who never liked that noise, as she called it, knew who he was from the evening news clips showing him in full makeup. And by the mid-70s, Alice wasn't just scaring parents, he was scaring interviewers too. The guy was drinking hard, and of course it showed. You turn on a TV special, and instead of a witty shock rock prankster, you might just get Alice Cooper mumbling through answers, wandering off topic, or wandering off the set, or just staring in a way that made you want to change the channel.
I thought that the parents were the ones that were much more disturbed, whereas the kids took me very lightly.
And I don't know if you saw this moment on a late night show around 77, and you thought, man, this doesn't look like the middle of a party, more like a hangover the next morning. Except it was always the hangover phase. And you know, it's kinda tough, because Alice Cooper was, and still is, a pretty real talent. The hits like School's Out and No More Mr. Nice Guy, they were great songs. Even the ballad You and Me was a soft rock staple. But in the interviews from that rough patch, it could get actually uncomfortable to watch. Like secondhand embarrassment levels of uncomfortable. You could just see the toll fame and the bottle were taking on him, and as a fan, you were worried.
I tell you, babe, well, that's enough for me.
But still, I mean, Alice was one of those guys you rooted for, even in the messy years. Yes, he might have slurred his way through a talk show, or two, or three, but you knew the spark was in there somewhere. And sure enough, he eventually cleaned up and made a comeback. But those mid-70s interviews, well, yikes. They're the kind of thing that made you shake your head and say, or maybe pray, yikes, I hope Alice gets it together. Sex Pistols on Bill Grundy's Today Show, 1976. On December 1st, 1976, British television changed in an instant, when the Sex Pistols were invited onto Tim's TV's early Evening Today program, after Queen pulled out at the last minute. That's because frontman Freddie Mercury nearly had to pull out a tooth. Yep, an emergency dentist appointment made this infamous Sex Pistols debacle even possible. And so, instead of a safe, polished rock segment, viewers got a punk powder keg going off live at 6 p.m. It all started when the band kinda shuffled onto the set, alongside members of their entourage, including Susie Sue, then still part of the infamous Bromley contingent of Pistols followers. And from the start, the host, Bill Grundy, treated them with a mix of condescension and baiting sarcasm, joking about their notoriety. Yes, it was meant to be cheeky TV, but then it spiraled. Johnny Rotten muttered "shite" under his breath, shocking enough for a tea-time broadcast. But the real explosion came when Grundy made a flirtatious remark to Susie. Guitarist Steve Jones unloaded a barrage of insults on live TV. Dirty bastard, dirty effer, effing rotter.
You dirty fucker.
What a clever boy.
What a fucking rotter.
Well, that's it for tonight.
The control room didn't cut the feed fast enough, and the words went straight out into living rooms across Britain. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Newspapers plastered it everywhere in the next morning, with the Daily Mirror's legendary headline screaming, quote, "The filth and the fury." Phone lines lit up with complaints, politicians condemned it, and suddenly the Sex Pistols were front-page villains. For many viewers, this was their first encounter with punk, and it was terrifying. But while parents and tabloids raged, young fans saw something else, a band unafraid to tear down the polite facade of mainstream TV. And record shops proved that. They reported a spike in sales, and the Pistols' reputation went from a local menace to national phenomenon overnight.
We're so pretty, oh so pretty.
The fallout didn't just hit the band. Bill Grundy, once a respected broadcaster, had his career destroyed by the scandal. The Today Show was soon cancelled, and Grundy never really recovered his standing. Meanwhile, the Pistols, well, they just leaned into the chaos, turning the controversy into rocket fuel for their rise. And looking back, that one short interview wasn't just shocking TV. It was the moment punk officially stormed Britain's living rooms, unfiltered, uncensored, and unforgettable. Brian Wilson, hit or miss in the 70s. Now, if you know Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, you know Wilson was always a bit of an enigma. We knew him as the genius behind those harmonies that made the Beach Boys sound like summer bottled up in a record. Good vibrations, God only knows, that was Brian's magic. But by the 1970s, the man who once gave us California Sunshine in a song was often sitting in shadows, and you never quite knew what version of Brian you were going to get. If you saw some of his interviews back then, it could be uncomfortable. Sometimes he'd be really quiet, giving just a word or two, almost like he wanted to be anywhere else. Other times, he'd drift off into these strange tangents, talking about cosmic things or making observations that left the interviewer wide-eyed and fumbling for the next question.
I was able to get a hold of all these drugs and they messed me up. They messed my mind up.
A lot of fans were thinking you're either hearing a glimpse of brilliance or you're watching a guy slip away in real time. The thing is, you could tell he wasn't trying to be difficult. It was just where his head and heart were during that era. And journalists just didn't know what to do with him. Do you press for answers or just let Brian wander where his mind takes him? Half the time you felt bad for the poor reporter, trying to wrangle a conversation that didn't want to be wrangled. Still, that was part of the Brian Wilson mystique. A hit-or-miss interview didn't change the fact that his music was timeless, and fans like me held out hope that he would find some peace.
If you should ever leave me, the life would still go on.
When he did resurface stronger later on, it felt like a victory to most fans. But in the 1970s, Brian was a reminder that genius and struggle often come hand in hand, and that could make for some very unpredictable TV. Mick Jagger, oddball then and now. Mick Jagger has never just answered questions. He's twisted them, teased them, and sometimes blown them up entirely. And in the 1970s, when the Rolling Stones were at the absolute height of their power, Jagger became infamous for using interviews as his own stage. One of his most quoted lines came from a 1975 interview when he said he'd, quote, rather be dead than singing Satisfaction at 45. And that one stuck. Fans repeated it for decades, critics used it as ammunition, and of course it's aged like irony in a bottle. Past 70, Jagger was still dancing across stadium stages to that very song, grinning as if proving the joke was always on us. The press never quite knew what to do with him. Jagger could be catty one minute and philosophical the next, dropping sly digs at other artists or mocking his own fame.
It's a funny voice, you know, it's like a voice that's never been one of the great tenors of our time.
Journalists complained that he often gave non-answers, but that was all part of the game. He kept himself elusive, untouchable. Rock critic Lester Bangs once wrote that Jagger was the ultimate showman because he even performs boredom. And I do think that sums it up perfectly. Even sitting in a chair, Mick turned interviews into theater. And it didn't stop in the 70s. Even in recent years, Jagger still throws curveballs at reporters, rolling his eyes at tired questions, poking fun at old drug rumors, or even slipping in cryptic one-liners about bandmates just to keep the tabloids buzzing. In 2012, when asked yet again about his wild youth, he simply quipped, "I don't remember half of it, and the other half I wouldn't tell you anyway." Classic Jagger, evasive, cheeky, and completely in control. What makes him absolutely fascinating to me is that this side of Mick never went away. The same man who taunted reporters in the 70s is still out there, needling them today, with that mischievous grin that says he knows exactly what he's doing. Love him or not, and I gotta say I love him. No one has ever made press conferences feel more like performance art than Mick Jagger. Honorable mention, Roger Waters. Roger Waters was never the kind of guy to sugarcoat anything, especially in the 70s when Pink Floyd was at the peak. The band had this mysterious aura, dark album covers, lyrics full of heavy ideas, and live shows that felt more like a trip through another dimension than a concert. But sit Roger down for an interview back then, and you'd see pretty quickly that he didn't have much patience for small talk. He was sharp, sarcastic, and if you asked a question he thought was shallow, he let you know it. I remember people saying, "Man, you don't interview Floyd, you survive it." And that was kinda true with Roger Waters. He'd roll his eyes, give those cutting one-liners, or just flat out dismiss a question if he thought he didn't get it.
Do you like festivals?
No. Why not? Because the acoustics are bad for me.
For fans, it was kinda funny. Here's this guy who just made Dark Side of the Moon, and he's snapping at some poor journalists who thought the songs were just about space. Roger wanted you to dig deeper, and if you didn't, you were in trouble. And that reputation has followed him well beyond the 1970s. Even in more recent interviews, he can come across combative, challenging the very people trying to talk to him. But honestly, it fits his personality. Pink Floyd's music was never about being easy or lighthearted, and neither were the words that came out of Roger's mouth. Maybe this wasn't one single train wreck moment like the Pistols or Lennon's about to give us, but Roger Waters does deserve a nod here. He was the kind of interview that left reporters rattled, and fans saying, "Classic Waters, prickly, brilliant, and just a little bit intimidating." Honorable mention, the Bee Gees vs. Clive Anderson, 1997. By the late 70s, the Bee Gees were untouchable. With Saturday Night Fever, they didn't just score hits, they defined an era. Stayin' Alive, Night Fever, How Deep Is Your Love? I mean, whoa. Those songs dominated radio, discos, and dance floors worldwide. But along with the fame came actually years of mockery, especially once the disco backlash hit. By the 80s and 90s, jokes about the Bee Gees' falsettos and polyester suits were almost as common as their hits had been. So when the brother sat down with comedian Clive Anderson on his BBC talk show in 1997, things were already primed for tension. Anderson was known for his sharp, often needling wit, and he wasted no time going for digs. Early on, he teased their falsetto voices and career ups and downs. Yes, not unusual for his style, but the Gibbs weren't laughing. The real breaking point came when Anderson reminded them of an old story that they had once jokingly considered naming themselves Les Tossers. And with a smirk, Clive added, "Well, you still are." And that was it. Barry and Robin stood up, visibly angry, and just walked off the set.
In fact, I might just leave.
Yeah. Oh, I've never had anyone walk out before, but...
We are a tosser, pal.
Leaving Maurice alone on the couch to nervously chuckle and try to defuse the situation. The audience, caught between laughter and shock, didn't know if it was a planned gag or an actual implosion. And spoiler alert, it was very real. The fallout was immediate. Newspapers covered it like a scandal, and fans debated whether the Gibbs had overreached or whether Anderson had gone too far. For the Bee Gees, who'd endured years of cheap shots about disco and had only recently enjoyed a career revival thanks to the Saturday Night Fever 20th anniversary, it clearly struck a nerve. Anderson later joked about the incident himself, but the moment lives on as one of the most awkward walk-offs in TV history. And yes, while it didn't happen in the 1970s, it did feel like the ghosts of that decade's disco backlash came back to bite. After all, the Bee Gees didn't just survive disco, they outlived it. But that night proved even legends have their breaking point. Honorable mention, James McCartney versus BBC Breakfast.
Everything you do, but this time I've fallen in love.
Being the son of Paul McCartney is no easy thing. Imagine trying to launch a music career when your dad is literally one of the Beatles. I just felt pressure trying to run my grandpa's corner store for the summer. I can't say I'd fare any better than James McCartney. Well, by the time James sat down on BBC Breakfast to promote his debut album, folks were curious to see if he had inherited that, well, even a fraction of that easy Lennon McCartney charm. But what they got instead was, well, a little less lively. From the start, James came across stiff, almost stone-faced, answering questions in a flat monotone. The host tried to inject some energy, but every reply seemed to wilt the conversation more. At one point, when asked about how long he'd been working on the record, he just sorta muttered something vague, like a couple of years, without any excitement to sell the magic of it. And then came the moment that sealed it. The interviewer joked about one of his collaborators being a guy named Paul McCartney and asked who that was. James deadpanned said, "Oh, he's my father."
Credit list credited with vocals, guitar, and drums called Paul McCartney. Who's he?
Oh, he's my father.
No chuckle, no smile, just flat delivery. I don't think viewers could tell if he was joking or being serious, and I'll be honest with you, I wasn't sure either. It was one of those moments that made you squirm in your seat for the poor host, trying to keep it afloat, trying to get some energy into poor old James. That particular incident wasn't in the 70s, but it's worth a nod because of the family connection, of course. The Beatles were still casting a long shadow over that decade, and here was Paul's own son, struggling to make a mark. It wasn't disrespectful in a loud punk rock way, more like the kind of interview that just fizzled before it even had a chance to get going.
I'm strong enough, strong as you.
Which, for however much fun it is to talk about, you have to reel for everyone involved. Interviewers want things to go smoothly, and the interviewee wants to have an easy time of it. But sometimes you just have to let it be. And finally, John Lennon, Rolling Stone interview with Jan Winter, 1970.
If I am dead already, girl, you know the reason.
If we're talking about the most raw, unfiltered rock interviews ever, which we are, that's the point of this video, nothing's gonna top John Lennon's marathon sit-down with Rolling Stone's Jan Winter in December 1970. The timing was perfect. The Beatles had just broken up months earlier, and the world was still in shock. Fans desperately wanted answers, and instead of spin or polite deflections, Lennon gave them something nobody was ready for: complete honesty with teeth. Over the course of hours, Lennon just let it all pour out. He tore into Paul McCartney, accusing him of trying to dominate the band creatively, sneered at the Beatles' myth-making image, and dismissed years of carefully cultivated charm. The Beatles were the biggest bastards on earth, he said at one point, flattening the idea of the Fab Four as lovable mop tops. He wasn't just venting, he was dismantling the legend in real time.
Look at Me was written around the Beatles' double album time, I just never got it.
And it wasn't just Paul who got scorched. Lennon mocked George Harrison's songwriting, at best one or two good songs. He called Mick Jagger a joke, and described the Beatles' fame as a prison. He spoke openly about his H use with Yoko Ono, therapy with Arthur Janoff's primal scream techniques, and his deep resentment at being seen as just a piece of pop merchandise. This wasn't the cheeky Beatle from A Hard Day's Night. This was a man cutting ties with his past. For fans, the effect was nuclear. Some were devastated to hear their hero trash the music and friendships that had defined the 60s. Others kinda found it electrifying. Finally, here was a rock star refusing to play nice, willing to burn it all down if it meant telling the truth. Jan Winter himself later said the interview felt less like journalism and more like a purge. In hindsight, that Rolling Stone feature set the blueprint for the tell-all rock interview, confessional, messy, sometimes cruel, but always unforgettable. John Lennon pulled down the curtain, daring people to see him not as a Beatle, not as an icon, but as an angry, flawed, painfully human artist. It was shocking, it was uncomfortable, and it was history in the making. Rock and roll has always thrived on chaos, and these interviews prove the mayhem didn't stop when the amps went quiet. Sometimes it was the booze, sometimes it was the bitterness, and sometimes it was just that wild streak that made these stars unforgettable in the first place. So, what about you? Do you remember watching any of these moments as they actually happened, or hearing about the fallout the next day? Did I forget any crazy interview moments from your favorite rock stars? Well, get down in the comments section and tell me about what I missed. Hey, I'll look it up and I can always make a round too. If you enjoyed this video, which we sure hope you did, please click that little thumbs up icon, it really helps our channel a ton. Make sure you subscribe for more trips back into the madness. But most importantly, from my entire team here at Do You Remember, I'm Nostalgic Nick, signing off, and trust me, I promise not to storm out mid-sentence. Bye now, y'all have a great day.